Hi, I'm Andrew Connell, and I'm an MVP for Office Servers and Services. In this module, we're going to look at how we can build native iOS applications with the Microsoft Graph using Objective-C. Specifically, we're going to do an introduction into the Microsoft Graph API. We're going to do a little bit of getting started stuff and understanding what we're doing here. And then we're going to do an understanding or an overview on building an iOS app and then creating an iOS application for Azure Active Directory and the Microsoft Graph. Microsoft's Office 365 developer vision focuses on the user's experience and their data. As a developer, you can bring your applications into their user experience. So with over 1.2 billion users of Office worldwide, this is a huge opportunity to provide a window into your different applications, as well as being able to connect into their data and add intelligence to your applications. There are currently 850 million events created a month and a total of 470 petabytes and more of data stored in the service that can add value to and for our users of your applications. So what does it look like to build an application that's going to be integrated with Office 365? Well, as you can see at the very bottom here, we've got access to a lot of different data sources inside of Office 365. And the best way to get to them is using the Microsoft Graph API. That Microsoft Graph API is going to essentially act as a proxy to all of these different services that are available to us. Now, in order to call the Microsoft Graph, we're going to have to first authenticate. And we're going to do that using Azure AD. And that's going to allow us to authenticate either using our consumer accounts, like a Microsoft account, or using our work and school account, or like an Azure AD based identity that we would use in Office 365. You also are going to be able to leverage the OpenID Connect, which is going to give us the ability to get some information about the currently logged on user. Now, once we are authenticated, we then have the option of many different ways that we can talk to the Microsoft Graph. And the way we're going to do that is using different environments. Now, in the case of this scenario, we're going to be looking at using Android Studio and working with a strong API SDK for the Microsoft Graph. And then we can build our application using anything else that we want to end up using here. So in this case here, we're going to build one that's going to show events from a calendar in Office 365. Now let's talk a little bit about authentication and how this works with the Microsoft Graph. The Microsoft Graph leverages Azure Active Directory or Azure AD, like so many other cloud services from Microsoft. And this is going to provide authentication and authorization capabilities for our applications. You can create web apps as well as native apps with Azure AD apps. And in addition, users can authorize the application using the delegated consent, where they grant the application to act on their behalf. Global tenant admins can also grant consent to all users as a different type of consent. We call that the admin consent. Azure AD application authentication is implemented using the OAuth 2 protocol. So users are redirected to Azure for authentication credentials so that the custom applications never get the actual credentials of the user. We just redirect them over to Azure, and then Azure is going to give us back some information or give the user some information that they will provide the application to log in. Depending on the authentication flow that we leverage, the app is ultimately going to get an access token that's only valid for a specific amount of time for a specific user with specific permissions and for a specific resource. In our case here, that's the Microsoft Graph. These access tokens can be refreshed after they expire using an associated refresh token. And the login process also supports multi-factor authentication and federated authentication that Microsoft's Azure AD supports. Now, native applications differ from web applications in a few different ways because first, they're multi-tenant by default, and you don't need to worry about sending app credentials or app secrets when the native app is distributed because it can't contain a secret because once you distribute the app, it's never really going to be a secret. So instead, we're going to use some special redirection URLs. Now, all Office 365 cloud services, including SharePoint Online and the Microsoft Graph, leverage Azure AD for authentication and authorization. And this means there is a single authentication flow that we're going to use for Office 365 applications, as well as those that are created to leverage the Microsoft Graph. So let's look at what the development looks like for an iOS native application that's going to call the Microsoft Graph. The Microsoft OpenTech group provides a native iOS SDK for the Microsoft Graph that is available on GitHub. And developers can leverage Azure Active Directory Authentication Library, or ADAL, for the Azure AD v1 authentication endpoint, or the Microsoft Authentication Library, MSAL, for the Azure AD v2 authentication endpoint in their applications, depending on the type of application that they're building. Now, unfortunately, the Microsoft Graph and the Microsoft Authentication Library for iOS, the native versions of these SDKs, they're not compatible with each other. So what you're going to end up wanting to do is either leverage ADAL for your authentication library and the Microsoft Graph iOS SDK, or if you want to use the Microsoft Authentication Library, which we're going to do in this module, you can just call the Microsoft REST API for the Microsoft Graph. So what does the development story look like for an iOS app? Well, developers are going to use Xcode, which is a IDE that's provided from Apple. App registration is going to be done using a couple different of the management portals. We can use Azure AD if we're using the v1 endpoint, or we're going to use the app registration portal if we're using the v2 endpoint. CocoaPods and Carthage are going to be used to build and package management, which is commonly used in iOS development. And they're similar to the MS Build and NuGet tools that we use in a .NET project. So when should you consider doing a native iOS application? Well, when you have complex user experiences and visualizations, or when you have device-specific capabilities you want to take advantage of, like say on iOS, Touch ID, you're going to need to do something with native. You're not going to be able to do one of the cross-platform options. But developers could also use a cross-platform option, such as Xamarin or Cordova, which have their own advantages and disadvantages. So let's talk a little bit about creating an iOS native Objective-C application for iOS. So the process of creating an iOS native application is similar to how you'd build any other native application. I would recommend that you first create the application using Xcode and then implement your user experience to get a good flow of how things are going to work. And then extend the application to support authentication and token acquisition from Azure AD. And then finally, integrate in the Microsoft Graph, either iOS SDK or the REST API, depending on how you set up your authentication. So here are the steps that you look at with creating a native app. You're going to first create the application in Xcode, which I just shown you the file new project experience that you see there. And then I'm going to implement the user experience. And so this screenshot is showing the different storyboards and screens and how the flow is going to work inside of my application. And then test your application prior to implementing the authentication and graph support for it, so that you can have screens and buttons wired together with dialogues and things that are popping up. It just doesn't have any business logic wired up to it, just the flow of the UI. So in this first demo here, I want to show you about how to create an iOS application, but we're not going to really create the entire app. What I'm going to show you is an existing app that I've already created, just in the interest of time, so we're not going to run through the whole thing. If you want to see how to create the application, refer to the lab that's associated with this screencast. And specifically, there's an exercise in there that walks you through the process of getting to where the app is right now, all the way from the equivalent file new project and opening up Xcode and then doing the file new project. So in here, I just want to highlight some of the things to our app and show that it's actually working. So if I go over here to the main storyboard, before I do that, there's a few things I've done. I've created a new controller for my application. So my controller here has an interface and a module associated with it, or an interface and a class is another way to look at it. So here I've got 3 different elements that are defined inside of my header file, which is my interface. I've got 2 buttons, so I have a login and a logout button, and then I have a activity indicator. And on iOS, that's the little spinning thing that shows that something's working. And then I have a module that's defined over here as well. So my module has 2 functions that are defined, a login and a logout actions, and they are of type iButton actions. So they can be bound to buttons. And I also have this other method up here for showing a loading UI, and I can use that for toggling the UI back and forth. And that's going to change, like if I'm not currently loading, or if I say that I want to show loading, then I'm going to turn the activity indicator on. I'm going to start animating it, and then the next piece here is to set the login button text. Otherwise, I want to stop loading, and so I'm going to stop animating it, I'm going to hide it, and I'm going to change the text to login button back to what it was. You can see down here on the login, I'm calling a function called show message. All of that is defined all up here, and effectively all that does is it just creates a new alert box effectively with a title and some text on it. So once that's then created, what I'm then going to do is I'm going to come over here to my storyboard, and if I zoom out a little bit so we can see it, here's the default storyboard that I've created. So initially when I added this in, I had a navigation controller. It gave me a navigation controller pointing to a table view. And this is where we're going to show all of our calendar events from my Office 365 subscription. So I didn't want the navigation to work like that. Instead, I need to have like an initial view that they go to that the user is going to first have to authenticate with Office 365 or a Microsoft account or Azure AD. So what I did first is, after deleting the default storyboard, I then went in and added this navigation controller from down here by just adding this guy in. And what that then did is, after I did that, I then came over to the properties for this one, and I set him as the initial view controller. And so what that's going to end up doing for me is that's going to tell the iOS operating system that says when the app loads, this is the entry point. Come to this navigation controller. And what I want the navigation controller to do is that once the app actually loads, and this is kind of like my boot up controller, I need it to change it from going from this controller to the table view. Instead, I need to go to a login view. And ultimately, once I log in, I'm going to redirect the user over to this table view. So the way I'm going to do that is I then added in a new view controller onto the screen here. And this is my login view controller. So the way I associated it with that navigation controller is I went to the navigation controller over here on the left. I clicked on the control button and held it down on my keyboard, and then dragged this over and pointed over here to this screen. And what that did is that said the relationship status was to the view root controller. So that's what's going to take the application is now going to segue when it loads over to my login screen. That's what took this arrow here that used to be over here. It's now pointing down here. Now, the other thing that we did is when I created my application here, and I'm now on this view, one of the things that I did with this is I came over here to his properties, and so I just select this entire scene, and I set the class equal to a login view controller. And that's this object over here that I had created. Now, what that gives me the ability to do then is that once I've done that, and I can now drop some different elements on the screen, like I was able to drop like a label for my title up here and a button, and also my activity indicator that you see right here. So I'll zoom in on that so you can see it easier. So once I've done that, I then took this button and I needed to associate this button with his handler and give him an ID. And the way I did that is if you come over here to this connections inspector, let me get rid of the two that are there right now. To first associate it with the ID that was defined in that interface, is I select the button, and on the referencing outlet, I'm going to grab this guy and drag him over here to the surface. That's going to reference then the header that this is tied to, and I'm going to say that this is my login button. And after I do that, I also want to say, well, what happens when you touch up gesture? So like if I click the button with my finger, I select it with my finger, and then I release it, that's the touch up event. And so what I did with that is I grabbed that same touch up event, and I'm going to point back to my controller, and it sees the two button actions that are available to me. So I'm going to tie it to my login action right here. And I have the same thing listed over here for my log out. So you see I have a log out action, and I have the log out button that you see listed here. So what happens with this? Well, when I load this application, we've already seen how this works, right? I've got my log out and my log in actions. So let's see this thing work. I'm gonna come over here to my Click run, and that's going to fire up the simulator. And here's our application that's running now. So what I want to do is I'm going to click this sign into Microsoft. And if you recall what that does over here is that when I click sign in to Microsoft, that's my login action. I should see an alert that pops up that says launch browser-based login, but this show loading UI, that was the method we looked at earlier that should change the title of our of the sign in button, the sign in to Microsoft. It should say connecting, and it should show and start animating our activity indicator. And if I click on it, we see that that's exactly what's happening. We see an activity indicator and the text change, and there's our box that shows up here. And so when I click on this OK, when that happens, that should then turn around. Now that that's done, I'm no longer showing my message here, because you can see that the show loading indicator from the method, the show message method, is now going to say pass in a false or no into this piece here, which should take the stop animating it, hide the indicator, and then change the sign in to 365. And if I do the same thing by clicking sign out, it should sign me out, and ta-da. So we have our UI has now been created and everything looks to be working just fine. So the next step is to add the authentication piece to it. We'll see that in the next section. Now in this section, we're going to extend our application to support Azure AD authentication in our iOS app. Specifically, we're going to look at implementing, leveraging the app registration portal, and then implementing MSAL for iOS applications. Now, the Microsoft Graph leverages Azure AD like so many other applications that we have out there. And we've already gone through a lot of the different topics here that I've already talked about in the previous section. We've already done that here on this slide. The key point here is that when you build for your authentication piece, you can use multiple different options for authentication. You can either use the Azure AD v1 endpoint or the v2 endpoint. And depending on which one you're going to use, it's going to also determine which SDK you can take advantage of that's offered from Microsoft. So if you're using the v1 endpoint, you're going to use the ADAL authentication library. However, the recommendation is to use the v2 endpoint. What the v2 endpoint is going to allow us to do is to have a little bit more flexibility in terms of defining permissions for dynamic consent and a couple other options as well. So the recommendation is to use the v2 endpoint and make your life easier by using the Microsoft Authentication Library. So let's talk a little bit about what the authentication story looks like here. So we've got our application that you see up there in the top left screen here. And what I've got is my end user who's down in the left, on the left side, who's going to be using my application that's up there on the top right or top left. So what I'm going to do is that my application is first going, when I say I want to log in, the application is going to redirect the user or send the user over to Azure AD, and it's going to ask them to authenticate. And what that's going to do is that's going to trigger, like in Android, it's going to trigger the browser to navigate over to the authentication endpoint for Azure AD. Now, I'm going to go through the authentication process. I may be prompted to grant consent to the application if I haven't done this before for specific permissions and resources that it's requesting. And then once that's done, the Azure AD is going to return control back to the native application, who is going to collect the response that came back from Azure AD and use that response to then go fetch an access token. So it's going to fetch that access token from Azure AD, and that access token is then going to give me the ability to call the different resources and endpoints that I requested when I went to authenticate for that endpoint. The key point here, though, is that my native application is never going to get the credentials of the user that's using the app. Instead, Azure AD you're going to send the user to Azure AD to go log in, and Azure AD is going to give that user some sort of a token or a code, and that code is a very short life code that then can be used by the application to fetch our access token. Now, let's talk a little bit about these endpoint versions that we have that are available to us. So I already mentioned a little bit about the v1 endpoint, but let's talk more about the v2 endpoint here. The challenge with the V2 endpoint is that it does introduce some breaking changes to the protocols, and this is why it's called a V2 endpoint, because the protocol is different and requires new client library implementations. It's going to present a converged authentication process, and what that means is that we can use a single library and a single endpoint to authenticate, but we can let users log in using their consumer or Microsoft account or their Office 365, or otherwise known as work and school account. So that's nice. It's kind of like a proxy over both of those different authentication endpoints. It's going to enable the same code for using the Microsoft Graph for using things like reading mail and retrieving contacts if I'm using the consumer services like OneDrive Consumer or OneDrive for Business, or Outlook.com's email and contacts offering and calendaring, or Office 365's contacts and calendar and emailing offering. I talked already a bit earlier about the dynamic consent. So what this is giving me the ability to not have to define the permissions up front when I register the application and force the user to then go through the entire process of accepting all the permissions and consenting to all the permissions as an all or nothing proposition. Instead, my application can request permissions at runtime from Azure AD, and if the user hasn't granted those permissions, then Azure AD will prompt the user to grant those permissions at that time. So some of the key improvements from V1 or V2 to V1 on the for the authentication endpoint. In the V1 endpoint, we had to provide a resource parameter to identify which resource that we were requesting an access token to. And unfortunately, open source libraries were not able to easily incorporate that into their requests. So now we use a scope parameter, which is supported by all libraries, to compound the resource and the permission at the same time. Now, when you build your applications with Azure AD V1, you had to register what permissions the application needed, and the user had to consent to all of those things up front, or otherwise known as statically consenting to them, as I mentioned in the last slide. But with V2, you can now send scopes that you want at the time you want them. You don't need to ask them for all the stuff up front. The changed contents of an ID token has been made in V2 to better conform to the OpenID Connect 1.0 specification, such as using the preferred username claim instead of something just called UPN, because UPN was more of a Microsoft-centric thing, and bet it wasn't as much of a standard. Also in the past, if you needed a client app, a single page app, a web API, maybe a native one, you had to create multiple app registrations and wire up relationships between them, which was a bit of a challenge. But the V2 endpoint now enables one app registration for a single logical application. So it's going to allow us to create multiple platforms or add multiple platforms to a single app registration. So let's talk a little bit about the SDKs, as I mentioned earlier. As there are changes in the protocols between V1 and V2 for Azure AD, it required a change in the SDK to a new conceptual model. We have this thing called a public client application, and that's going to use the registered application ID. You also have a confidential client application that's got a secret. So it's going to be either a client secret, like a password, or an X509 certificate. Now, the Microsoft Authentication Library is considered as the successor to Azure AD Authentication Library, otherwise known as ADAL. This module is going to focus on leveraging MSAL and Azure AD V2 endpoints to talk to the Microsoft Graph. So we have a couple different ways that we can register our applications. Azure AD gives us two different options or UI options for registering apps. The Azure AD portal is used for apps that are leveraging the V1 authentication endpoint, while the app registration portal is used for the V2 application endpoint. You're going to self-select yourself into one of these based on the endpoint that we're going to use. So for instance, because in this module, we're going to use the V2 endpoint, that means we have to use the Microsoft Authentication Library, which means we also have to use the app registration portal for creating our application. For Microsoft Graph apps, it's recommended to use the V2 endpoint, as I've said before. So you're going to use the app registration portal. You're going to first create the application, which is, think of it more as like registering the application. When I say create, I don't mean like you're going to an IDE and creating a code base just yet. You're just simply registering the application for use inside of Azure protected resources. Once I've created the application or registered the application, I'm going to obtain a copy of the app ID that's going to be presented. And this is going to come across as a GUID. This is the unique ID for our application. I'm then going to go down to the platforms section and I'm going to add a new native application and add the necessary permissions if I want to define them up front, or at least the minimal permissions that are required. So let's look at implementing Azure AD authentication for iOS-based applications. Now, the Azure AD team provides an iOS SDK for native iOS applications using both Azure AD or ADAL or the Microsoft Authentication Library, MSAL. We're going to leverage MSAL in our application. So the way you're going to do this is you're going to add it to your project using Carthage. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a build and package management tool that is commonly used in iOS development. The steps for getting it added are documented quite well on the MSAL page for the SDK that Azure AD provides. But associated with this lab as well, or this module as well, is a hands-on lab that walks you through the exact same process of how to get this added to your project. Now, unfortunately, the MSAL and Microsoft Graph iOS SDKs are not compatible with each other. So when we get to the Microsoft Graph piece, we're going to have to use the REST API to call the Microsoft Graph in order to use the Microsoft Authentication Library, at least at the time of the recording. So in this first demo, what we need to do is we're going to need to create an Azure AD native application, and we're going to do it using the application registry portal. So you're going to get to the app registry portal by going to apps.dev.microsoft.com. And I want to log in with either a personal account, like a Microsoft account, or a work and school account. So I've already navigated to that page. And so I'm going to log in here with my login. And this is going to take me to a list of all my applications. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new application here. And I'll just call this my test native application. And I'll go ahead and click create. Now, once I click create here, the first thing that I want to make sure that I do is I'm going to want to scroll down and grab this application ID because I'm going to need this in my application. So I'm going to copy this and I'm just going to paste that somewhere that I can use later. Now, the next thing I'm going to need to do, because it's a native application, is I need to go create a new platform. So I'm going to scroll down here to platforms and click platforms and then click the native application. Now, it's going to give me this custom redirect URL. Now I'm going to go ahead and copy this. I might not need it though, depending on the kind of application I'm creating. But some of them only need this ID right here and they can craft the rest of it. And that ID is, as you can see, the exact same ID as my application ID, a little bit higher up here. Now, I don't need to go through and specify my permissions. That's something that I can request dynamically with the dynamic consent. But just to show you how to go about doing that, I'm going to click on add and I'm going to look for the calendars .read permission right here and select it and then click OK. And I'm doing that for the Microsoft Graph based permissions that I'm going to go collect here. So once that's all done, everything is finished, I'm ready to go. And so I can just go ahead and click save. And with this, I now have a new Azure AD application that's been configured for working with a native application. In this next demo, we're going to look at how to take an existing iOS application and extend it for working with Azure AD and authenticating. And specifically what we're going to do is we're going to extend it to use the Microsoft Authentication Library. And so by the end of this demo, what you should see is an iOS application that we saw in the previous demo that when I click sign in, it's going to take me to the login prompt for Azure AD, and it should return control back to my iOS application once I've gone through the common consent, once I've gone through a successful login, and I should see some information about me displayed in the UI here, so I can see a successful login. So there's a few things that we've done ahead of time. First of all, I've already gone ahead and created my Azure AD application from the app registration portal. And once I've done that, I also had to go grab the ID to that application. So the first step that I'm going to have is I'm going to come over here to this info plist, and down here under URL types, if I open this up, I had added in a big XML structure in here, which you can get to if you just want to go straight to the code. I can just go straight and see the actual code with this instead of like the source code like this down to the XML and just see this section that I added right here. As part of this section here, you can see that there's in this array piece right here, there's a string that says MSAL, enter your client ID. So I'm going to grab that internet client ID and I'm going to paste that in. That's the ID of an application that I created using the native client. So I'll take that and I'll save my changes. And the other thing that we did is if I come back over here to my application is I created this new file called a cart file. And this is working with Carthage, and it's similar to NuGet or any other package manager that you're used to. But for iOS, Carthage is a pretty popular option. And what we're doing is we're getting the Microsoft Authentication library for Objective-C for that we can use in iOS. I'm pulling that straight from the master branch in GitHub. So what I do is I grab this. I then have to go to a command prompt and go ahead and update it. So if I come over here, and I open up a terminal and go to this application, so here I'm inside of this application, inside of a terminal, and if I do run a Carthage update, it will download the Microsoft Authentication library and pull everything down for me that I need. Now I've also gone through and I configured the app to use the Microsoft Authentication library. So over here under the build phases, I created a run script, and what it's doing is it's copying all the frameworks from the download, and then I'm adding in the MSAL framework from the build for iOS that it pulled down. So you can see that that's listed over here in my authentication framework. So we have this now actually included. So now I have this this dependency is now included as part of my project. I've also gone through and set up the ID. So now the next piece is that, what else do we have to do to get the authentication working? So if I come over here to my app delegate, this is one of the things that I had to do that it wasn't that you have to do to essentially get control back from the Microsoft Authentication library. When we triggered the authentication process, that's going to open up a browser on the iOS device and navigate to the authentication endpoint or authorization endpoint for Azure AD. Now, when that's finished, it's going to close the browser and redirect back to my application. But what I need to do is I need to handle the response that comes back. So I need to, when the response comes back, I need to consume that response, and so that I can parse it and get the results that came back. And that's where MSAL is really going to come in handy, because I'm just going to add in this method right here that says that when I open a URL, I'm going to use the MSAL public client application and call the method handle MSAL response, passing in that URL, and that's going to set up all of the callbacks and everything it needs to get the code back from the authorization endpoint to go fetch an access token. So I had to first import this header file and then add in that function. Now the next thing I did is I created a thing called an authentication manager, and this was just to make my life a little bit easier. This has a bunch of properties on it, so things that you would see with an Azure AD app, so a client ID, the authority, the MSAL client, the user ID of the currently logged on user, the user object, and the access token, and then a few methods like clearing credentials, so when I want to log out, things like acquiring a token completion, acquire a token with scopes, those different methods. And then I went over here and I implemented all of these different methods for authenticating with the Microsoft Authentication library. So first here I'm initializing it with an authority. That's defining this completion method as well. And if I scroll down a little bit here, here's where I'm actually acquiring a token and fetching a token out. And then here is the method for acquiring a token completion when I pull that stuff out, and also when I want to sign out of the application. Now, to wire up the authentication, if I then go over here to my login view controller, I then went and changed some of this code a bit as well. So the first thing we did is I went ahead and changed this so that I have my authentication manager is being imported in, as well as the user object, the Microsoft Authentication Library user object. And I'm also going to set up an authority of where I want the login to actually happen here. So the first thing, before I did this, actually, let me back up. Over here into this interface, or right here, is I added into the interface, I added in this thing called a scopes property as well. And then, if I scroll down a little bit, you'll see the login action, the code changed quite a bit. So what we have here is I'm changing the scopes, or I'm creating an array, and the array is I'm looking for these scopes, user.read, count, and calendars.read are the two things that I really want to get back for this. All of this code then goes through and says initialize it with the authority and go handle the login part, like acquiring the token with scopes. So here's just this error handling that's going on right here. Farther down, assume that I got a successful authentication here. I'm then calling this dispatch async to dispatch the get main queue. And what that's going to do is I'm going to set the loading UI method. I'm going to set that to false, so it's going to get rid of the fact that I'm trying to go through the, have the activity indicator spinning and such. And then we get a reference to the user from the authentication manager class that I had created up here on line 61, because the authentication now has succeeded. I'm going to change the state of these two buttons that we have for login. And I'm simply going to create a new string here that's going to say authentication successful for whatever my name is, and then put in parentheses my ID, which is my login. And then I'm going to display that message on the screen. The logout controller, I'm not really doing anything with it just yet. I could add this later, but this is where I would clear the credentials. So let's see if this is going to work for us. So I'm going to go ahead and go to run. And now our application loads. So I'm going to click Sign into Microsoft, and we can see that's redirecting over to the Azure AD endpoint. And thankfully, it already knows who I am, so I don't have to go through that login process and typing in the password. So I'll click on this. And I've never used this application that we created, so I'm first going through my test native application. So I'm going to click the Accept button to go through the Common Consent Framework. And that's going to redirect me back over to my app. And sure enough, we see successful authentication. This is the part, the string that I created here, where it says it succeeded for me, and there's my ID. And so I'm in good shape here. So with that, you've seen how to add in the authentication piece into your application. The last step now is just to integrate the Microsoft Graph, and we'll see that in the next section. In this last section, we're going to look at how to integrate the Microsoft Graph into a native iOS app. So we're going to talk a little bit about the iOS SDK for the Microsoft Graph. We're going to talk about the Graph Services client, how you make requests, and then we're going to look at the REST API, because as I mentioned previously, there are challenges in using the native SDK for the Microsoft Graph for iOS if we're using MSAL. Now, developers can leverage the Microsoft Graph REST API in any type of an application, and Microsoft also provides a native iOS SDK for the Microsoft Graph, and that's great when you're using the ADAL authentication endpoint. It abstracts away the details of working with the REST API, and it also provides a fluent API for creating requests. But as I've mentioned earlier, the iOS SDK for MSAL is not compatible with the Microsoft Graph iOS SDK. So we're going to leverage the REST API. But there's also another authentication component that you can take advantage of. from the Microsoft Graph team called the NXOAuth2 adapter. And I have a link there to it on the screen if you want to look at using that instead of using the REST API. But you would use that instead of using MSAL to use the Microsoft Graph native iOS SDK. So let's look at how we can integrate the Microsoft Graph for iOS apps. Just like the Azure AD MSAL iOS SDK, the Graph team gives us that native SDK. Now, if you wanted to use this in your application, you're going to use CocoaPods to do that, which is a build and package management tool that's commonly used in iOS development. This is similar to like MSAL or MS Build or NuGet in a traditional .NET project. To get it added, you're just going to add an entry for pod MS Graph SDK and then point to the version that you are looking for. And we've talked about previously about using the REST API, and while we're going to do it inside of this application, we're going to leverage the Microsoft Graph REST API because the native iOS SDK is not compatible with the Microsoft Authentication library. So here's some code for calling the Microsoft Graph REST API from Objective-C. You can see at the top of the screenshot here that I have the URL to my endpoint of the query that I'm going to make to the me/events endpoint, and then I'm going to specify that I only want the 3 fields to come back: the subject, the start, and the end date for an event. A little bit farther down is where I'm going to create the actual request, but you can see where I'm changing the header values to the kind of data that I want to get back, which is JSON data. And then I also am updating the header to put an authorization header with the value of bearer space with my access token that I've obtained from MSAL so I can handle my authentication. And then I'm just going to call the authentication. And when that succeeds or when I get a response back, I'll be able to parse out the response and do whatever I end up wanting to do with that, such as passing the data off to another view. In this last demo, we're going to see how we can take our existing iOS application that has been configured to authenticate with Azure AD using the Microsoft Authentication library, and we're going to update it so that it can now go get data from the Microsoft Graph. But there's a few things we need to do here with this. So the first thing I'm going to do is I first went in, if you remember from our user interface, if I go to the storyboard, from our interface here, I have this other view here for a table, and I need to go through and figure out how do I want to display stuff. So what I first did is I came over here to the, created a new modular interface here for a calendar table view. And so here I've got a list of events. So this is just an array of items here. And I then went into the method, this interface over here, the class, and I went ahead and coded up a bunch of stuff for us. So we have things like, a couple of things like, an image with color, converting it to a date string, a couple utility things there. And then I have some other stuff here about for just displaying information with it, for reloading the application and showing events. But the important part I think that is interesting with this is right up here, the request that we have to get events. So you see here I have this get events method here that needs to be called. And so I have a method here that I'm overriding that's called the view did load. So when it loads, I'm going to call, this is like the constructor here for the view. What it's going to do is it's going to call, set the events list. I'm going to call init, and then that's going to call the event called get events. So that's what this is. So get events is going to create an instance of our authentication manager. You can ignore all this. This is just some UI, gratuitous UI stuff that we did just to make it look a little nice. But the graph piece is interesting. This is where I'm creating an endpoint that I'm going to go query against, which is going to use the REST API for graph. Okay. I'm then going to say create a new HTTP request, and that request is going to be a GET request. I'm going to set the value for the content type header equal to application/JSON and say that I'm interested in getting back application/JSON as my data format back. And then I'm setting the authorization header equal to the access token that we got in our authentication manager. And so we have our authorization header value, and then there's the bearer space and then the token. So I'm just going to assume that all of this runs, everything's fine. We got our data back. Once we get our data back, I'm then going to come down here and I'm going to set the data equal to the application that just ran that we want to go through and show all of our data. So I'm going to stop animating our spinner. I'm going to remove it from the view. And because I'm going to be dispatching this to back to our main thread and saying the table data view is equal to reload data. So we have all of our events. And so here we're just going to go to our table view and call reload data. So that's all set up. There's some other stuff a little bit farther down here in the view here that's going to understand that when we're going to enable cells, when the cells get rendered out, that this is our view. It's going to know how to render out all the cells by getting the data back and setting things to different values. So we'll see how this works in just a moment. I'm going to go back over here to my storyboard. And if I come over here to the calendar scene that we've created here, you can see that I've set up that this is tied to the view called my calendar table view controller. And so there's a couple things that we did here. Let's move this down a little bit. You see here that for this entire storyboard, I've called this my calendar list. All right. So what I did is I called that my calendar list. So here we go, calendar list right here. I gave my calendar list a name of calendar list up here. So that's the label for it, you see. And then on the table view itself, the table view itself right here, I gave it a name of calendar list cell. So that's the actual cell that's going to show up. And then there'll be a whole bunch of cells coming down for each item in the table view. So there's the label right there. So inside of that, if I zoom in on this, you can see that I've added in two labels here. I've got a subject label and a date label. And so for each one of these, so if I go to the subject label, a couple things that we've done with this is I've given it a name of subject label. If I go to his properties right here, we can see that I've set the tag equal to 100. So that's just a name. Now I could have given it a better name than this, but I just gave it a name of 100. And my date label, same thing. It's got a label of 200 here. And that's how in the code where it's getting the subject label, let's get rid of these breakpoints. The subject label is finding a label equal to a tag of 100. And then down here, I'm doing the same thing with 200 to set the text value on these two different things. Okay, so that's how the view has been set up to display the data that's being set to it. But the next trick that we have to do is we have to figure out that once we have a successful authentication, I need to show this screen here. And so the way we did that is over here on the login controller. If I come down to the login action, we've made some additional changes to this. So when a login is successful, so when we don't error out here, when a login is successful, we are going to come down here and we are going to, so that's where we're actually getting the token right here. I am going to change how the UI looks. So if there's an error in logging in, I'm going to do some stuff to show some error messages and say check the log. But assuming everything is fine, I'm going to turn off the loading indicator. I'm going to change the state of the buttons. I'm going to go get a reference to my storyboard, which is storyboard main, which we can see here is called storyboard main. And then I'm getting a reference to my calendar view control. And I'm doing that by going to the board, which is right here, going to the board, the storyboard, and I'm instantiating an instance of my view controller with an identifier and using my calendar list as my view identifier. You remember where I gave that as the storyboard ID. Then I'm going to my navigation controller, which is the main thing on my application, the main thing where we came in, and I'm going to push the view controller of this view controller and say I want it to be animated. So if I now come over and I run our application, we'll see the simulator, get it installed, and I click sign into Microsoft, and you'll see it's already signed in, so let's sign out. Let's try it again, sign in. And you can see I'm logging in, and it's going to make me go ahead and type in my email. As well as my password. And it's going to navigate back to the login controller, which takes me over here to view the data coming from my calendar in Office 365. So in this demo, you saw how to take an existing application and what was required to add in a bunch of stuff to get the Microsoft Graph to work and to call the REST API for the Microsoft Graph. We're not using an SDK in this case, we're using the REST API, so I didn't have any other components that I needed to add or any other dependencies I needed to add to this application. And with that, that brings us to the end of our module here. I hope you've learned something about working with an iOS native application and calling the Microsoft Graph once you've authenticated with Azure AD. One little note that I'll give you here is that of all the demos that we did inside of this screencast for this module, these were all the results of a application that was already built, and we were kind of poking around the code. If you'd like to build that same application yourself, this screencast is part of a bigger training module. And that training module has a hands-on lab, and each exercise in the lab maps to the things that we built inside of the, that we use as the results for each one of the different demos. So if you want to build the same application, go check out the hands-on lab that's associated with this module. So thank you very much for your time, and I hope you learned something.